Hello, welcome to another Purple Insider Extra. Matthew Coller and Sam Ekstrom here. And Sam, Jim Harbaugh, not the coach, is the headline, rather than Kevin O'Connell will be the next head coach of the Minnesota Vikings. Give me your reaction to the Vikings spurning Jim Harbaugh, who told reporter Mitch Albom that he was very enthusiastic about the job and really wanted to come to Minnesota, but the Vikings were less enthusiastic about the idea of having Jim Harbaugh.
In the end, I think the Vikings got it right. I think that when you are looking at a coach that's as polarizing as Harbaugh, as controversial as Harbaugh, as expensive as Harbaugh, you need everybody on the same page. And if you've got ownership with doubts, if you've got maybe your players in your leadership council who have doubts, or if your GM is skepticism at all, if he doesn't have the right answers for you when you ask about the roster, if he's trying to win too quickly, maybe ahead of where your timeline is at, I think that is legitimate cause for concern to not hire somebody. And I think that some of those are very realistic. I think when you hire someone like Kevin O'Connell, who can align with a first-year GM, they can build this thing together. You've got a longer leash, certainly, with O'Connell. And this is just the way of things. Young, offensive-minded, first-time coach. I looked this up earlier. 24 of the 32 coaches in the NFL were hired for the first time ever in 2017 or later. So that's just the methodology, is you find guys that have upside, and hey, it's working out for a lot of these teams too, including the Rams, who were in the Super Bowl, and the Bengals, who were in the Super Bowl. So you can absolutely win with an upcoming first-time coach. The Sean McVay coaching tree has a lot of success so far. And I think the next big question is, what do you do with Cousins? But in a vacuum, I think this is actually the right move, even though there are some that will say Jim Harbaugh's a winner. He's, won everywhere he's gone. But the only part that really matters to me is, what is he going to do now? His past results do not influence the future results. So could he come in here and just snap his fingers and win? That's not the way it works.
Right. And in San Francisco, go back and Google the roster and the players that he had with that team. They had Pro Bowlers and Hall of Famers all over that squad. And that's not to take away from getting them to NFC championships and a Super Bowl appearance, but the league has changed quite a bit in recent years. And I think there's a reason why the Vikings were the only team to interview Jim Harbaugh as he returns to Michigan. And I don't know how you could ask an ownership or a general manager, or like you said, even the player leadership council, to hire somebody that everybody wasn't on board with, but especially at the ownership level. If there was any trepidation there, they're the ones that are cutting the checks. They're the ones that are signing themselves up to probably 7 years of Jim Harbaugh based on what Matt Rule got as a contract, what John Gruden got as a contract. I mean, you have to really be convinced that this is going to be your guy if you're going to open the checkbook for what it takes to get Jim Harbaugh. Now, when it comes to Kevin O'Connell, this has sort of been remarkable to me how many people have been upset that they ended up with O'Connell and not Jim Harbaugh, because O'Connell is going to be in the Super Bowl shortly, running an offense that was one of the best passing attacks in the league, a team that threw to their number one wide receiver more than anybody else in the entire NFL in Cooper Kupp, and continues to use innovative ways to get him open, which is exactly all the things that Vikings fans would have wanted when they fired Rick Spielman and Mike Zimmer, is to have a young general manager and a head coach paired together. Somebody who comes from an offensive background, a former quarterback in Kevin O'Connell that played for a number of NFL teams, and then who has worked his way up the ladder in the quarterback space. He's been a passing game coordinator. He's been a quarterback's coach. He's been an offensive coordinator. All these things are the opposite of what Mike Zimmer was, and they're the things that I think Vikings fans would have wanted from day one of the coaching search to land with Kevin O'Connell. So they made the right decision from that perspective. Also, if you're being realistic, you have to look at this roster, look at their salary cap situation, look at their quarterback situation, and say, this probably takes a couple of years to be a legitimate contender. That doesn't mean you have to be horrendous. It doesn't mean you have to tank. And I don't think they're in a position to tank. I think you're in more of a position to be like Philadelphia next year, where you could make the playoffs, you could be competitive, but you're not really there yet as a mature roster. And especially if you draft a quarterback, you're always going to need that first year that has a lot of rocky moments. If you draft a quarterback, that's much better of a fit for a first time coach than it is for someone like Jim Harbaugh, where you would expect to win right away. And my question would be, how were you going to give him the players that he would need to succeed? Because there is no magic potion that Jim Harbaugh has. The players on the 49ers were great. The players that he recruits at Michigan are great. The players that he had at Stanford, Andrew Luck, he was great. Like that's usually how you end up winning. And if you position yourself on teams with great players, you usually look like a genius as a coach. But I think that having a lightning rod as a head coach was not really what they wanted for this space and time.
Yeah, we'll say this about the Vikings. They did the opposite. That's what a lot of teams do, is they go antithetical to what they had before. But it's hard to win in year one as a head coach. The only Vikings coach of the 9 they've had to ever do it was Dennis Green. And he's probably, the second best coach in team history behind Bud Grant, and had a ton of success. But you look at the last few coaches, Mike Tice didn't make the playoffs until year 4, Brad Childress, year 3. Leslie Frazier and Mike Zimmer did it in their second year. And I think that that's probably the target that you can realistically hope for if you take a mature approach to this. If O'Connell and Kwesi make moves that indicate they try to win in year one, I think it's going to hurt them long term. Like if they're trying to keep Cousins around at all costs and keep this roster intact, we've seen this scramble go on each of the last several years, and it has not worked out for the Vikings when they're constantly trying to retain veterans, plug holes with Band-Aids at other spots. If the Vikings use 2022 to get the finances right, bring in some young players that will fit the system, that they can groom and get a lot of reps and not bury them behind one-year contracts, that sets them up presumably with cap space and hope in 2023, where you have players that have gotten reps, you've got money to spend, you probably have a young quarterback at that point. I think that's a healthy way to look at it. And I feel like a young offensive mind like Kevin O'Connell is someone who's probably in a good position to steward the growth of that young quarterback.
Right. And I totally understand where Vikings fans would look at what you just said and say, oh, come on, do we have to wait? And the answer is there's really no other option, because the Vikings not deciding to go the rebuild route after 2019 is kind of the cause of where they are now. They hung around in the middle, and you end up with a poor cap situation, an expensive quarterback, and not enough talent on the roster to legitimately compete for a Super Bowl, and no route to get there. They don't have the cap space to walk out into free agency and say, hey, let's rebuild our team in 1 year with a bunch of huge signings. They just don't have the money to do that. So they would have to scrap and claw to get enough cap space to bring players in here. And well, they just tried that last year. I do think what the Kevin O'Connell hire says is that the Wilfs are understanding of that timeline and believe that it's the right timeline to exist on, which I think was a major question for us going into this coaching search, Sam, was, do they want to turn this around quick? Do they buy into the narrative that the Vikings were really close last year because they had a couple of close losses? I think the answer is no, that they're not buying into that. And they look at it much more as a long-term play with the best possible combination that you could have for being modern. I think they go from as old school as you could get in the NFL. If we were ranking their old schoolness, they would have been probably 30th in the league. And now for their modernness, they shoot up to the top of the league.
Yeah, a GM who comes from an analytics background, very different. You've got the probably one of the trendier coaches on the market from an offensive standpoint. I mean, if you were looking to get the flashy new offensive coordinator, you got him. I mean, he's got a little more seasoning than Kellen Moore. He comes from a better coaching situation, like with his head coach, than Kevin Moore. Sean McVay has produced, Zach Taylor, Matt LaFleur, Brandon Staley was on his staff. Like, there's a lot of good minds in a very short amount of time that have come out of that team. So that's very encouraging. And this is someone that, from everything I've heard from people in LA, great bedside manner. He's got tremendous communication ability. He's going to keep it together. He's not going to sort of lose his cool in front of his players or the media. He's going to be more balanced. And I think that's exactly the approach the Vikings were looking for.
Yeah, I agree that if you're going the opposite direction, go fully the opposite direction and try to correct the sins of the past with what they had with Mike Zimmer and Rick Spielman. Thanks for your time, Sam. Thank you all for listening. And remember, we do the podcast every day. So wherever you get your podcasts, type in Purple Insider. There is so much there in terms of reaction to the Vikings spurning Jim Harbaugh and going with Kevin O'Connell instead. So until then, we'll catch you here next time on Purple Insider Extra.